A soldier in a Vietnamese jungle reaches for something on his own webbing that fits his hand exactly the way a childhood object once did. Round, roughly the same weight, the same general size he had already thrown thousands of times before he ever actually enlisted, at a diamond somewhere back home he probably has not thought about since the day he actually shipped out. He does not need to relearn a throwing motion under fire, does not need to consciously think through the mechanics of the throw itself, while everything around him is actively trying to kill him. His body already knows this motion completely, and that single fact, more than any explosive filling or fragmentation pattern the weapon actually carried inside it, is exactly why the United States military built the weapon this specific shape in the first place. Why would the American military deliberately design a grenade to feel exactly like a baseball in a soldier's own hand, an oddly specific engineering choice for a weapon meant to kill rather than entertain? Why did an earlier version of that same idea actually explode the instant it hit something rather than after any countdown at all? A genuinely different and considerably more dangerous design philosophy. And why, after more than half a century of continuous service across nearly every American conflict since Vietnam, is this specific grenade only now, in the past year, finally being replaced by something else entirely for the first time since it originally entered service? The baseball grenade concept did not actually begin with the weapon most people today would immediately recognize from decades of continued American military service. During the Second World War, the American Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that would eventually become the CIA, developed something called the T13, nicknamed Beano by the operatives who actually carried it. A slang term borrowed directly from a baseball pitch deliberately thrown at a batter's own head, a genuinely fitting name for a grenade built around the exact same sport's own most familiar object. The T13 carried the exact same dimensions as an actual Major League Baseball, roughly 9.5 inches around and weighing only about 5 ounces, considerably lighter than the weapon that would eventually replace it decades later, and it detonated the instant it actually struck something rather than counting down on any kind of timed fuse at all. A genuinely aggressive design choice that traded the safety margin a delayed fuse normally provided for the tactical advantage of instant, unpredictable detonation. Thousands of these grenades shipped to Europe ahead of the Normandy landings, carried by frontline troops into exactly the kind of chaotic, close combat where a weapon that exploded on contact rather than several seconds later offered a genuinely different tactical advantage against an enemy who could otherwise simply pick up a thrown grenade and throw it right back before the delay fuse actually ran out. Before we get into why the military actually walked away from that same baseball concept for more than a decade afterward, if you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. The baseball shape disappeared from American service almost entirely once the war actually ended, the military instead adopting the oval, lemon-shaped M26 for the Korean War and the earliest years of American involvement in Vietnam. A shift away from the earlier baseball concept driven by genuine tactical and manufacturing considerations rather than any dissatisfaction with the underlying throwing motion advantage the T13 had already demonstrated. That specific shape change reflected genuine engineering priorities rather than any dramatic tactical reversal, but by the late 1950s, American ordnance engineers had identified a real problem with both the older Mark II pineapple grenade and the newer M26, an inconsistent lethal radius that meant a soldier throwing either weapon could never fully predict exactly how far the actual danger zone would extend once it detonated, a genuinely serious concern for both the enemy the grenade was meant to injure and the soldier who had just thrown it from what he assumed was a safe enough distance. Development began on a genuine successor specifically designed to solve that inconsistency, and engineers returned directly to the same baseball concept the OSS had already tested and validated more than a decade earlier during the previous war, a spherical shape that distributed fragments considerably more evenly than any oval or teardrop design ever actually managed across a genuinely wide range of testing conditions. That returning design became the M33, and in 1968, during the height of American combat operations in Vietnam, an improved version with an added safety clip entered service as the M67, the grenade that would go on to define American infantry combat for the following 5.5 decades of continued military service across nearly every conflict the United States actually fought during that same span. The baseball shape was never simply an aesthetic or manufacturing choice made for its own sake. American soldiers had already spent their entire childhoods throwing baseballs with genuine accuracy and genuine power, a physical motion trained into muscle memory long before any of them ever actually enlisted or received a single day of formal military training, and a grenade shaped and weighted to match that same familiar object let a soldier's own existing throwing mechanics transferred directly onto the battlefield without requiring any specialized retraining most other weapon systems would have genuinely demanded. An average soldier could reliably throw the M67 roughly 30 to 35 meters, using nothing more than the exact same motion he had already practiced on a sandlot or a little league field years earlier. A genuine tactical advantage built directly on top of an entire generation's own shared cultural experience with America's own national pastime. The M67's own specifications reflected genuinely careful engineering rather than simple imitation of the earlier T13 concept that had first proven the underlying baseball-shaped concept decades earlier. A spherical steel body containing 6.5 ounces of Composition B explosive, the entire weapon weighing 14 ounces total, with a pyrotechnic delay fuse burning for 4 to 5.5 seconds after the safety lever released, giving a soldier just enough time to actually throw the weapon and find cover before it detonated without giving an alert enemy enough time to simply retrieve and throw it directly back. The lethal radius extended to roughly 5 meters, with a considerably larger casualty-producing radius reaching 15 meters and individual fragments capable of traveling as far as 230 meters under the right conditions. Numbers soldiers training with the weapon learned to respect with genuine seriousness, given how little margin actually separated a soldier's own position from the danger zone his own thrown grenade was about to create, only a few dozen meters away. The weapon proved genuinely effective across the specific combat environments Vietnam actually produced: jungle ambushes, rice paddy firefights, village clearing operations, and the notoriously dangerous underground tunnel complexes both American and Vietnamese forces fought through for years at considerable cost to soldiers on both sides of that same underground war. Soldiers also used the M67 for booby trap construction throughout the war, a considerably less glamorous but genuinely significant secondary application that extended the weapon's own battlefield role well beyond simply being thrown by hand during a direct firefight into something closer to a defensive area denial tool. The grenade's own reliability under exactly the wet, humid, genuinely difficult conditions Vietnam's own jungle terrain actually produced helped cement a reputation for dependability that would follow the design through every major American conflict for the following 5 decades of continued, largely unchanged service. Training with the M67 itself relied on a genuinely clever, practical solution. A dedicated inert training variant designated the M69, identical in weight, size, and general handling characteristics to a live grenade, but incapable of actually detonating at all, allowing soldiers to practice the exact same throwing motion, safety procedures, and general handling repeatedly without any of the genuine risk a live weapon would obviously introduce into routine training exercises. That same training grenade came finished in a distinctive, highly visible blue paint, specifically chosen to prevent any dangerous confusion between an inert practice round and an actual live weapon during training exercises where soldiers might realistically handle both within the same single session. The weapon's own design also specifically accommodated left-handed soldiers without requiring any separate variant or specialized equipment, right-handed throwers holding the grenade with its own fuse assembly facing upward, while left-handed soldiers simply inverted that same basic grip, a small but genuinely thoughtful design detail that meant the weapon's own core throwing mechanics worked equally well regardless of which hand a given soldier actually favored. Here is what that same reliability actually cost American forces once warfare itself began changing in ways nobody in 1968 could have specifically anticipated when the grenade was first adopted. The M67's fragmentation pattern, precisely the feature that made it so effective in open jungle terrain, became a genuine liability once American forces increasingly found themselves fighting in the close, enclosed urban environments Iraq and Afghanistan actually demanded, where fragments bouncing off walls and door frames inside a confined room could threaten the exact same soldiers who had just thrown the weapon in the first place moments earlier. That specific problem, a design perfectly suited to the war it was actually built for and increasingly poorly suited to the wars that followed decades later, finally prompted the Army to approve its first genuinely new lethal hand grenade since 1968, the M111, a weapon developed at Picatinny Arsenal that relies on blast overpressure rather than flying fragments to actually incapacitate a target, a mechanism considerably better suited to clearing a single room without the same friendly fire risk. Fragmentation had always carried inside confined spaces where walls and furniture offer flying steel considerably more opportunity to ricochet back toward the very soldier who had actually thrown it. Marine Corps veterans who actually carried the M67 across multiple separate combat deployments consistently described the weapon in remarkably similar terms, regardless of which specific conflict or decade they had actually served in, a genuine rarity for any single piece of infantry equipment expected to remain functionally unchanged across such a broad span of continuously evolving warfare. That consistency itself became something of a quiet point of pride within American infantry culture more broadly, a weapon soldiers could genuinely trust to behave identically, whether they had trained with it during the height of the Cold War or carried it decades later into the mountains of Afghanistan, a level of institutional confidence considerably harder to build around a weapon system that required frequent redesign or genuinely inconsistent field performance across different production runs manufactured years apart from each other. A single M67 grenade cost the American military roughly $45 as of the most recent publicly available figures, manufactured continuously by Day and Zimmerman across decades of steady, uninterrupted production before that same production line finally began winding down as the M111 gradually takes over the role, a genuinely modest price for a weapon that has remained in continuous, active service across every major American conflict fought since Vietnam without requiring any fundamental redesign of its own core mechanism across more than 5.5 decades of continued use. This is not a story about a single grenade design, simply persisting unchanged for more than half a century out of pure institutional inertia or bureaucratic reluctance to fund a replacement, since the M67's own remarkably long service life reflects genuine, repeated validation across nearly every major American conflict fought between Vietnam and the present day, from the Falklands and Grenada through Panama, the Gulf War, and 2 full decades of continuous fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, each conflict giving American forces genuine, hard-won field data, confirming the weapon's own continued reliability, under conditions its own original 1968 designers could never have specifically anticipated when they first finalized the design. It is a story about how a weapon shaped specifically around an already familiar American physical skill, one nearly every soldier had already practiced for years before ever picking up a rifle, could outlast the specific war that had actually produced it by more than 50 years, only finally giving way once the fundamental nature of the battlefield itself had changed enough that even a genuinely reliable, genuinely proven design could no longer fully answer what modern combat actually demanded from it. The M67's own influence has extended well beyond American service alone across its own long production history, variants and near copies turning up in conflicts entirely unrelated to any original American supply chain, including documented use by forces on both sides of the ongoing war in Ukraine, a genuinely striking testament to how thoroughly the underlying spherical fragmentation concept has become a kind of universal default or infantry grenades across dozens of separate militaries decades after American engineers first settled on the shape specifically because it matched a baseball. What do you think mattered more to the M67's own remarkable staying power across more than 5 decades of continuous service, the actual explosive inside it, or simply the fact that American soldiers already knew exactly how to throw it before they ever picked one up? Leave your answer in the comments below.